Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be discussing about reference to transfer pricing officer and assessment proceeding. All transactions between related parties in India must comply with transfer pricing laws. Transfer pricing is a concept that has been applied to ensure that all commercial transactions between various entities of a multinational company are conducted at an arm's length price. If the assessing officer has any issues about the appraisal of transfer pricing, he or she may refer the transaction to a transfer pricing officer. Today, we will go over the actions that an assessing officer must take to refer assessments as well as the duty of a transfer pricing officer. So let us first discuss reference made to a transfer pricing officer by the assessment officer. A transfer pricing officer may be referred to by an assessing officer for the calculation of arm's length price in an international transaction. The officer can decide the arm's length price for the transaction by issuing a written order after reviewing the available facts and documentation. The arm's length price should be roughly equal to the open market value of the item or product, which is the core of the international business transaction. The essential requirement for issuing a reference is that an assessing officer should be satisfied that the taxpayer has been engaged in an international transaction with an associated firm. The key information of such a transaction would generally be available in the accountant's report. These data would aid the assessing officer in reaching a decision on whether or not a reference is required. The Central Board of Direct Taxes has provided detailed guidelines for the purpose of implementation of the transfer pricing provisions by the assessing officer and the transfer pricing officer. The threshold limits have been enhanced. The assessing officer must obtain prior consent from the jurisdictional principal commissioner of income tax or commissioner of income tax before referring to the transfer pricing officer. Now, if the case is flagged during the scrutiny stage due to a transfer pricing risk parameter, the assessing officer is mandatorily required to refer the case to the transfer pricing officer irrespective of any threshold limit. The cases selected for inspection on non-transfer pricing characteristics may also be attributed to the transfer pricing officer if the assessing officer detects the presence of an international transaction or if a transfer pricing adjustment in excess of Rs 10 crores was made in a previous assessment year. The department recognized that aggregation of many transactions may be done by a taxpayer for the purpose of benchmarking a particular transaction, and in this context, numerous transactions may be referred to the transfer pricing officer if the scrutiny or inspection is prompted on account of transfer pricing risk parameters in relation to a particular international transaction. So let us now discuss the duties of transfer pricing officer. The job of transfer pricing officer begins upon receipt of a reference from an assessing officer. This job is limited to determining the arm's length pricing in connection to each specific international transaction reported to him by the assessing officer. If the officer uncovers the presence of a few transactions that have not been referred to him by the assessing officer, the officer must address the situation with the assessing officer so that a new reference is obtained with regard to such discovered transactions. The transfer pricing officer is obligated to consider all the relevant facts and data while calculating the arm's length price, as well as is required to adopt the most appropriate technique for the computation of the same as specified by the law. The transfer pricing officer is then obliged to issue a thorough order outlining the method of calculation, data specifications and justifications for arriving at the said arm's length price. It is required to provide the assessee with a formal opportunity to be heard before making any modifications to the total income declared by the assessee in his tax return. If a mistake is discovered that is obvious from the record, the transfer pricing officer may also revise any decision granted by him in accordance with the provisions of Section 92 CF5 and the provisions of Section 154 pertaining to rectification of mistake will be applicable accordingly. If the transfer pricing officer makes a change, he must transmit a copy of his revised order to the assessing officer, who must then amend the order of assessment in accordance with the transfer pricing officer's order. So what are the obligations of taxpayers? Under the income tax laws, an income tax officer has the authority to scrutinize the books, papers, documents and income tax returns of any employer, taxpayer or any other person who is subject to or who the ITO considers to be subject to the provisions of the Income Tax Act dealing with verification of the accuracy of any return made, or if no return was submitted, ascertaining the tax due under the Act. During the said examination, the assessee should give the ITO his or her entire cooperation. The income tax officer may require a taxpayer to attend a hearing or examination and provide any books, papers, documents or income tax returns in his or her custody or control for any legitimate purpose. a person, member of the Bar Council of India or a chartered accountant in practice may aid or represent the person. The records and other papers of any SSE, employer or any other person who is subject to and who an ITO considers is subject to the provisions of the Act must be open to inspection by the income tax officer during business hours and must be kept for 8 years after the end of the assessment year to which the records or documents pertain. In addition, the income tax officer may conduct an oath examination of anyone who appears to have knowledge of any income that has been or would have been subject to taxation or any transaction that has the potential to affect such income. During the examination, the assessee should provide the ITO his or her entire cooperation and support. Before determining the income and finalizing the assessment, the assessing officer shall provide the assessee an opportunity to be heard. To make sure that all references are dealt with in a timely manner and effective manner, a record of all such developments should be kept in the approved format. Such a form will serve as a valuable database for future reference. For more such content, please like, share and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.